said I'd talk about CITES and the global policy agenda, but since I could talk about CITES for hours up here, I won't talk about all the other aspects of the global policy agenda. Real quickly, we've heard a lot about shark fin trade. Can you hear me, or do I don't need to be closer to the mic. What is international wildlife trade? And I stress that because the shark fin trade is part of international wildlife trade. Yes, it's food. Sharks are food anyhow, but it's also part of this vast global trade of wild species of animals and plants used for food, pets, ornaments, furniture, curios, leather, medicine, you name it. Estimated, and I think this is a way underestimated, to be worth about $160 billion a year, is estimated also to be the second largest direct threat to wild species after habitat loss. It's only because I'm saying climate change is an indirect threat, I'm not saying it's not a threat. So what is wildlife trade? And it's a global problem, therefore it requires multilateral international solutions. Animals and plants taken from the wild from one country or on the high seas, imported into another, that problem, the issue, the threat can never be solved without multilateral solutions involving multiple countries. And if we talk about unsustainable trade, illegal trade, I could talk about all these pictures, but I only have 20 minutes. It comes in many shapes and sizes. You hear a lot about ivory trade, that's mahogany being traded from the rainforest, but the shark fin trade, these are sharks in the market in China, is also part of this global problem of unsustainable trade. Not illegal trade, because there's hardly any laws controlling it. Okay, so what is CITES? We've heard mention of it a bit. It's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. In every country other than the United States, it's called the Washington Convention, because it was negotiated in Washington, D.C. 40 years ago, as of March 2nd, actually. 177 countries are now parties or members. And what's most interesting, it's practically every country in the world. There are a few countries that aren't. We can play a little trivia game and we can guess which the countries are, but any country involved in any international trade is already is a party. So CITES gets together every 2 years under the treaty. It's slipped from 2 to 3 years because of the tremendous financial cost of hosting one of these. And the countries meet to make decisions. Between these meetings, governments are required to implement the treaty. They have to make sure that these animals and plants that are listed on CITES have a permit in order to move across borders. And customs officials have to confirm there's a permit for any CITES listed species. And there are about 34,000 species listed in CITES. I'll talk about it in a minute. CITES gets together every 3 years. Hate to say, I admit I've been to every one since COP7, and I've seen it grow and I've seen it change, and I've seen how it's changed, and in the question and answers, happy to talk about any of that. But the next meeting is in 2 weeks in Bangkok. Oh, that's just a picture of me at the last one. We'll skip that. So how does... It's the only picture someone took, and it was of me on the screen. So how does it work? Well, it regulates trade by species being included in one of three what are called appendices. It's an appendix to the treaty. If you studied international environmental law, implementation of that's part of the treaty and therefore mandatory to implement, except for governments that may take a reservation within 90 days of the listings. Countries have to establish a management authority that issues permits and a scientific authority that determines if the trade is sustainable. What's really interesting, this is very different than a lot of the treaties post-Rio in 1992. A great deal under CITES is mandatory and decisions are taken by a vote. If they weren't taken by a vote, if it had to be consensus, nothing would be protected. But at least it's a very high bar, 2/3 of the countries, but at least consensus is not required. And there's a secretariat in Switzerland that helps the countries administer the treaty. So what are these appendices you hear about? What does Appendix I mean? It means these are species threatened with extinction. These are words in the treaty. And they may be affected by trade, and international commercial trade is prohibited. Trade is allowed to zoos, aquaria, scientific research, not for commercial purposes, if there's a permit from the importing and the exporting country that says it's okay, it's legal, it's sustainable. There are about 900 species protected. And that's most of the focus you'll hear about: anti-poaching, enforcement efforts. You've heard plenty about elephants and ivory. These are some of the hot button issues, the controversial issues that take a lot of attention. These are not decisions that the governments make anymore on listing the species. The governments get together and talk about what they need to do to implement it, and et cetera. Tigers in Asia, big cats, a big problem. All the illegal trade in tiger bone going into China. Indeed, China has a major role to play in almost all of these. Rhinos and rhino horn smuggling is an increasing problem. Whales are an issue that consumed CITES for many years since the International Whaling Commission moratorium. Is that 5 minutes already? No, okay, fine. I know that I'm talking fast. It can't be 15 minutes already. And sea turtles as well, and the whole international trade in hawksbill shells, for example, was a major issue in the 1990s, but it has stopped because basically a lot of political pressure was put on the few remaining countries involved in that trade. What are some marine species, since we're talking marine species? In Appendix 1, I've mentioned the whales, mentioned the sea turtles. Those are sea turtles in the marketplace, all illegal in Indonesia. Sawfish are in Appendix 1, all but one species. The story with that photo, if we have time, I can tell you the story. And of course, whales, and that's a picture I took of whale meat in the marketplace in Japan. So what's Appendix 2? And Appendix 2 is the heart, I like to say the heart and soul of CITES, because it's about the sustainable use. These are species that may become threatened with extinction unless their trade is subject to strict regulation. So it's not every species, but this is not about endangered or threatened species. They belong in Appendix 1. These are about species that could become threatened if their trade were not properly regulated. Commercial trade is allowed. It's a photograph of an American alligator. It's a photograph of an American alligator purse, one of the most heavily traded species in the world. One of them, about 400 to 500,000 skins a year traded from the United States. I used to run the program. It is completely sustainable. It really is exceedingly well run. All the hard corals are listed in CITES Appendix 2, not completely sustainable and not completely well run at all. It's a function of the governments and the government's ability to implement it effectively. But CITES Appendix 2 is the key to ensuring and helping governments to ensure that trade is legal and sustainable. What are the marine species listed in Appendix 2? I'll go through it quickly. The humphead wrasse, which is a reef species that is traded for the live reef food fish trade, mostly into China, but other Asian communities. Sturgeon, traded for caviar. European eel. Seahorses, I have a slide on that. The corals, giant clams, etc. I put these lists here because those of you going to CITES, you'll hear governments say CITES never has listed marine species, except for the ones that it has. I'll skip that because we don't have a lot of time. So a couple of quick case studies before we get to the sharks. The sturgeon, all of the sturgeon were listed in 1997 because of the totally out of control unsustainable caviar trade. And that's just sturgeon and caviar coming into the market and how it's processed. Always surprised how many people don't know that you have to kill the sturgeon female in order to get the eggs for caviar. It is not perfect, and the implementation, particularly by countries surrounding the Caspian Sea, are not perfect, but a recent scientific paper in the peer-reviewed literature was able to demonstrate that these stricter controls have been having a positive effect on limiting the amount of fraudulent illegal caviar entering the market. There is evidence of benefit for sustainability of the populations. Is the situation perfect? Hardly. You've got Russia and Kazakhstan and Iran and around the Caspian Sea. It can't be perfect, particularly in the Russian Federation, but it is much, much improved. And the status of these species, it's always hard to prove, but would be far worse without the CITES controls. I have a personal interest. I helped write that proposal in 1997, but that was not my paper. Seahorses are a really interesting case study. They were listed in CITES, all the seahorse species, in 2002. They're traded internationally. Most of you will think to aquaria. They are, but the main threat to the species is traded for traditional Asian medicine, and that's just a picture of seahorses in the market. They're also on the market in the US, but mostly in China, Hong Kong, and other Asian communities. About 24 million seahorses are taken from the wild every year. There are some real problems still with implementation of this listing, but some countries, such as the Philippines and Indonesia, are trying very hard to implement it sustainably and effectively. Queen conch is another one. How many of you have ever eaten queen conch? You're from the Caribbean, okay? It's a very large commercial fishery. If you count in numbers of individual animals, maybe one of the largest CITES trades. It was listed in 1992, also submitted by the United States. Earlier on, about 90 states and territories were involved in the trade. It's very important economically, and the consensus of the countries within the wider Caribbean where it's found is that it is working. The trade is much more sustainable than it was. Some countries have closed their fisheries in order to protect them, and because they got pressure from CITES once it was listed, they weren't implementing it effectively. They just had a meeting a couple months ago of the range countries for queen conch in Colombia. They're making a presentation to CITES to show how effectively it has been implemented. So it's just a positive story. Is it perfect? Again, no, but it's much, much better than the totally unregulated trade before it was listed in CITES. So, which brings us to sharks and CITES. CITES meeting in 2 weeks in Bangkok. So which shark species are currently listed in CITES? Take no credit for, I wish I could say I took that photo, but I did not. The whale shark and basking shark and great white shark are listed in CITES Appendix II. That's great. It was really significant when they were listed to break the ice on listing sharks, but these are not sharks that are heavily traded. Even though there was tremendous opposition from certain countries, these are not the sharks who will have the greatest potential of benefit from a CITES listing. There are 4 proposals that have been submitted. I'll talk very briefly about each of them. 3 of the hammerheads, the poor beagle, the oceanic whitetip, you've heard that a couple times, and the 2 species of manta rays have been proposed for listing in CITES Appendix II. They've been proposed by a number of governments, but all those 177 parties, if they show up, they have their credentials, they all get a vote. It's not only the countries that are range countries or coastal countries, and you have to get 2/3 vote of those voting. If a country abstains, leaves the room, doesn't have credentials, it doesn't count. So the first is the proposal for the scalloped hammerhead. I'm not going to go into all the data in the background on the proposal. I'm happy to share it with you. It's all on the Secretariat's website. And 2 species that are called lookalikes. And because as Damien mentioned, you can identify hammerhead fins, but you cannot really easily distinguish the fins of the great and smooth hammerhead from the scalloped hammerhead. So in order to be listed in CITES, the proponents didn't have to show that the great and smooth hammerhead qualified biologically. They only had to show that the scalloped hammerhead qualifies biologically. The proposal was submitted by all of those countries. What's really significant to me, having this long CITES history, I have never seen more countries co-sponsor a single proposal, which is a very good sign. This was submitted last time. It missed by 5 votes. Everyone is working very hard. Yourselves, Shark Stanley's working on it, we're working on it, so are all these governments to try to get 2/3 plus 1. It is significant to see that many Latin American countries cooperate on anything, but certainly to co-sponsor a CITES proposal. Some of these governments, I wouldn't say have never submitted a CITES proposal, but most have never submitted a CITES proposal, and certainly they have never submitted a marine CITES proposal. They submitted mahogany way back when. That's just a map of the range of the scalloped hammerhead. And just to show you, I'm not saying that the IUCN assessment of a species is the standard for listing of CITES, because the criteria are different, but I've just included the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, Shark Specialist Group assessment of their status. The scalloped hammerhead and great are assessed as endangered globally. So this is not something that we're dealing with a highly abundant species and thinking it might become threatened. Based on my experience, if you had the data that we have for the scalloped hammerhead for any terrestrial species, they would be going into Appendix I. But at least what we need is to put them in Appendix II. The hammerhead fins are called a preferred species by Asian traders because it's a very highly valued fin, and they're believed to be, we can't be sure because they're not required to report anything, between 1.3 and 2.7 million hammerhead fins in trade internationally. So the reason for supporting this isn't to stop the trade, it's to make it sustainable. And if every government that exports then has to certify it sustainable, obviously the trade will decline. Quickly, the poor beagle has been proposed by the EU. The EU is not a member of CITES as the EU. All 27 countries are members individually. That's why I always get wonky and say the 27 European Union member states. And the poor beagle proposal was co-sponsored as well by Brazil, Croatia, and Egypt. Poor beagle is valued both for its fin and its meat. Very, very popular, very highly desired meat. This is the range of the poor beagle. It's critically endangered and endangered in the North Atlantic and Northeast. It's vulnerable globally, and the greatest opposition we're worried about can come from some of the countries in the southern hemisphere, but at least we have some Latin American co-sponsors. The oceanic white-tip shark that we can identify by its white tip has been proposed by Brazil, Colombia, and the United States, and it's very much subject to finning, particularly in tuna fisheries, and it's believed to be between 250,000 and 1.3 million are traded every year. Again, this is the range of the oceanic whitetip, but a species can be threatened or potentially threatened even if it's that wide-ranging because of how extensive they're taken, particularly in tuna fisheries. The manta rays, the two manta ray species, the oceanic and reef mantas, have also been proposed. I know I'm running through it quickly. Their gill plates are traded internationally for soup into China and Chinese communities as a tonic. A tonic means to feel better, but they're not traditional in the traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia. So it's a actually relatively new trade. If I say about 4,000 are traded a year, it doesn't sound like much, but based on the populations and the life histories of the manta rays, it's potentially very harmful. Some populations have had declines of 86%. The data are sketchy because there has not been as much research looking into manta rays. So this may be the hardest one to get past. This is the range both on the left of the oceanic manta and the reef manta. IUCN has assessed them as vulnerable globally. That doesn't mean none of the populations are endangered or the species may be endangered. That just was based on the data available to IUCN. So I know it was a quick run through. Why is CITES such an important tool? Why is it so useful? Why is it worth this tremendous effort? Why have 37 different countries co-sponsored these proposals for sharks, knowing it's an uphill battle, knowing there's going to be a lot of opposition? Well, CITES plays this major role in management of international trade in species. It's also all there is. It's not like there's another treaty out there that does the same thing. There are regional fisheries organizations that may manage some fisheries, may manage tuna fisheries, but nothing else regulates international trade in wildlife products across borders. CITES is responsible for that, and there's a whole process. Governments have to submit annual plans, annual reports, and they have to submit the data, reports, everything. There's a whole bureaucracy that goes with it, and the value of that bureaucracy is really to monitor this trade. CITES listings, and there's a wealth of evidence, stimulate conservation action at the national and regional and international levels for species that are listed, above and beyond the CITES implementation itself. We've seen many governments there. We have the Endangered Species Act in the US, and CITES is implemented in the US under the authority of the Endangered Species Act. In some countries, the only endangered species legislation they have is CITES. So by listing it there, the environment ministries who want to do the right thing and are often the least funded can get more support from their governments when it's a CITES listed species. And CITES has teeth. Governments under CITES are required to have laws with penalties for non-compliance. They're actually required to do that, and if they don't, there's been a process of sanctioning in CITES so that countries do have laws, do issue fines, etc. Even in the United States, if a species is listed in CITES and it's imported illegally, it's a violation of the Endangered Species Act. It's potentially, not always, but it's potentially a felony, with jail time and very high fines. And again, CITES complements efforts in other regional fora because nothing else has this many governments participating. So what are some of the blockages? What's the problem? We've got the science, it's a great treaty, everybody's happy. Why is this such a heavy lift? When I first started working in CITES, a very long time ago, scientific information was all you needed. If you had the US and you had the European Union, which was fewer countries then, you would win. That's all you needed was the right science, and everyone would sit there and do the right thing. It's not sufficient anymore. It is critical, but it's not sufficient, and that's because of the political pressures from a number of trade interests. The tuna industry, which is the industry that takes many of the sharks, and the shark industries combined are worth billions of dollars. These are not industries will come forward and say, you're right. We should care about the long-term health of our planet. We should care about sustainability. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. That's not the way it works. They want short-term profits. The pressures they put on their governments, the political pressures are very intense. CITES, many governments will continue to say, these are fish. They're not wildlife, so therefore they should be regulated by regional fisheries organizations. My answer is they should be regulated by regional fisheries organizations. In addition, the two can be complementary. But tuna management organizations are barely notice that they're taking all these sharks, and they don't regulate international trade. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization, a number of governments say, let FAO regulate the sharks. FAO regulates nothing. Therefore, they can't regulate shark trade. But there's a lot of pushback from fisheries interests in a number of governments, and particularly governments in East Asia. The East Asian bloc, China, Japan, South Korea, should come as no surprise, are not exactly the greatest supporters of marine conservation or listing these species in CITES. And one of the fundamental issues is looking at fish as species and wildlife in addition to looking at them as food, when in reality, sharks and any other fish species, they're the last great wild food, but they're still wild species, part of their ecosystems, and need to be managed not only as if they're food and for food security, but also managed as wildlife as part of their ecosystems. And finally, why it's so difficult is that a political strategy, I don't even need a full 5 minutes, a political strategy is required to win this, because there's a political response is required because the pressures against it are political. They're not scientific. I was in Japan 2 weeks ago, talked to the Japanese governments about this, and they said, we agree with you on the science. It's not a problem. We don't want any marine species in CITES on principle, ever, ever, ever again. Now Japan's not happy the whales are there, and everything is clouded by the whale issue in Japan. But when governments react that way, even though the treaty requires them to make decisions based on science, that doesn't mean they will. So what we're doing, the Pew Charitable Trusts, Pew Environment Group, working with other governments, is in addition to making sure we have the science right and convincing governments and others of the science, working on a political strategy, working with governments, assisting them so that they at the highest level can exert whatever political pressure they want to counteract the political pressure that's coming from the opposite direction. I think that's my last slide. The point is, stay tuned. Those of you who are coming to CITES, I'm happy to help you navigate what's going on in the three-ring circus in Bangkok. But do stay tuned. If any of you are from countries other than the United States or the European Union, we'll tell you how to lobby your country. If you're from the United States or the EU, lobby other countries. The US is great on this issue. The EU is great. Number of other countries, Brazil, I just spoke with the Colombian government foreign ministry day before yesterday. They're fantastic. They want to do everything they can do. So I'm hopeful, but nervous, but I'm still guardedly optimistic that we will win, hopefully on all, but on most of these at the CITES meeting in 2 weeks. And with that, I'll just say thank you, and I guess we have time for questions.